Good morning. Get comfortable. We'll be in here for another hour or so. I am still Captain Drazinski, a friend of Lucky 7 Seminar. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Bob Jones today. He's going to talk a little bit about how to do operational art and design. He is a retired Army Special Forces colonel. He served in operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, also in the Philippines and Afghanistan. He was also a district attorney in Oregon, so quite a varied career. He is currently the strategic advisor to the J5 at SOCOM, that's HappyCom, and comes from us from beautiful Tampa. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Bob Jones.
Okay, am I on? Good morning. So coronavirus, the debates last night. We live in interesting times. I've been thinking about that. We live in interesting times. Most of us think that's an ironic blessing. Some people say it's actually a Chinese curse. And we don't know for sure because as Americans, frankly, we don't understand the Chinese that well. All right. And this is probably... Your mic, you're on the podium. All right. So they didn't switch me on here? All right. So
Sir, your mic is turned off.
Oh, I was assured.
I know, right?
I was assured this was...
It's on the side.
It's on the side, okay.
Okay. All right. Are we on now? You know, the Air Force always promises you they're going to put you on the drop zone too, right? No. Hey, so, but more important than do we understand if we live in interesting times or not, do we understand what our interests are? I was at an event last week. It was a SOCPAC event done at the Naval Postgraduate School, and they were looking at the Indo-PACOM AOR, and they were talking about, how do you support resistance amongst populations that could potentially be coerced by the Chinese, okay, as a very valid soft mission here in the competition phase of things. And as I was listening to the conversation, we're in a breakout group, and I asked the question, well, what are our interests? And a warrant officer in the room, very, very competent tactician, tremendous experience in the PACOM AOR, says that's not important, right? If we get told to go someplace, you go someplace, you just do it. No time to be pondering what are your interests. And then a major got very excited, sitting behind me. He goes, sir, I know what our interests are. That's my job. All right, I've read the national security strategy. I've read the national military strategy. I've read the national defense strategy. I've studied these. I prepared information briefs for the boss. We know what our interests are. And then another major piped up and said, and you weren't there, but we got a briefing from the Indo-PACOM commander himself. And he went on the map, and he went place by place around the theater, and he told us what our interests are. Okay, so they all knew what the right answer was. They knew what the interests were, according to the strategy documents, according to the commander. Okay, but as I was thinking about it, I'm sitting in a room, and there are representatives from various nations there, allies and potential allies, and I was thinking, China. Of all the potential threats that are named in our strategies, China is probably the one that could actually cause us the most serious problem. And I don't think any of those named threats are at any risk of invading the United States of America or imposing some sort of significant existential military defeat on us. So the real issue is lead the rules-based system. Lead the rules-based system. China's greatest threat to the United States is that they could displace us as the leader of the rules-based system, and they could make us follow Chinese rules. So what are our interests? I think our interests are, how do we maintain that leadership role? And how do we continue to be the ones who decide what the rules are? Now that's a very different thing than protect the nation and all these other various interests that are designated in the strategy. And it should affect how we think about doing things, because the Canadian officer sitting next to us, Canada doesn't really care if China leads the rules-based system or if the United States does, so long as they feel like they can be successful within the context of the rules-based system. So we need to appreciate, as we're going out and we are doing our planning, doing our designing, that we are taking into account the fact that our allies, who we're going to rely upon to support us in our endeavors, have very different interests than we do, very different perspectives than we do, and they're going to see things very differently than we do. All right, and I understand now you guys have been working on the design process for a couple of weeks, so you've been working to understand the strategic environment, and now you're working to figure out what do you want the future system to look like. The reason I started with this little vignette is I think as you are thinking about those things, as you're working to understand the current environment, as you're working to figure out what you want a future system to look like, you need to be doing that even though you've been told by higher what your interests are. You need to be doing that with a very kind of clear perspective on really truly what is it we're trying to do with this particular operation. These guys, as they planned the invasion of Russia, knew what the strategic environment was, but they absolutely did not envision that the future operating system would be Soviet soldiers taking pictures in front of the Brandenburg Gate next to their tanks 3 years later, 6 years later. Similarly, these guys, as they planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, in no way envisioned that just a few years later, an airplane that hadn't been invented would drop bombs that were impossible on top of their country. Similarly, these guys, when we decided that Vietnam was important, whether it was preserving the colonial interests of France or whether it was preventing communism from expanding into the region, never envisioned that this is how the operating system was going to look like at the end, climbing off the embassy roof onto a helicopter. Nor, 18 years ago, as we now plan to sit down and talk to the Taliban, did we envision that the future operating system was going to be the Taliban in control of over half the country, us totally frustrated and just looking for a way to get out with our dignity intact. Nor did we imagine, when we went into Iraq, that when we got done doing everything we're doing there, defeating ISIS, that we'd be facilitating the reemergence of a Persian empire whose sphere of influence once again is stretching from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush. All right, so what's the first tenet I think we need to take away as we as planners, we as designers are thinking about these things, is that we can't see the future. But the better you understand what the strategic environment really is, not what just someone told you it is, or how it's been defined, or how it's been understood to be, or how it's codified in your doctrine, the better you understand the problem, better you understand these things, then hopefully you can be better than the other guy. Better than the other guy at understanding these things and avoid these pitfalls that are so easy to fall into. Okay, so two roads diverge. There's always choices. When you're doing the planning process, you're doing your design, there's always choices to make. Today, what we're going to talk about are the art of war and the fact that there probably aren't very many artists in this room, to be perfectly honest. Maya, okay, how do you advance an idea as far as possible, not so far that your commander can't grasp it? Good answers versus right answers, the importance of understanding problems, the nature of strategy, the role of human nature in strategy, and then lastly, 15 tenets that kind of my own personal lessons learned that I've bumped into or have bumped into me over the course of the last several years. Okay, so we get to our second tenet. We're 2/15 of the way through. All right, design. Design is not a destination. Okay, it's not a process. I know you've got a book on planning that's sitting on your desk. You got a book on design sitting on your desk. The military, for your convenience, has codified both of them. This is not paint by numbers. All right, so you need to be willing to step back from the process when you're doing design and realize it's a journey. It's a journey. It's not a destination. It's not a process. It's a journey. So you're going on a journey. You're going on a journey with your team. Okay. So design is art. This may be the most famous basket of bread in the world, or maybe the second most famous basket of bread, because this one wasn't used to feed a multitude. But this one was used by this guy to graduate from art school. All right? You had to prove that you were a technically proficient painter to get out of this elite art school, Salvador Dali. Okay, now he went on, once he said, okay, there, I proved it. I know the science of my profession. I have talent. I have trained. Now get out of my way and let me do my art. All right? And so he did. And then 20 years later, he went back and produced what I think is probably the second most famous basket of bread for this guy. And if you notice, it's even better than the first one. So 20 years of meandering around, painting the most crazy paintings, that whole time, he never lost sight of the fact that you need to maintain the skills of your profession. Okay, so be an artist, but never lose sight of you still got to be able to paint a basket of bread. So for all of us, same thing. Be a designer, okay? Be a good designer. Be the best designer you can be. It's very important. But never forget that you can never be a good designer if you can't paint a basket of bread. Okay, but to design well, you got to be an artist. All right, you got to be an artist, and that takes talent, and a lot of us don't have that. I think of design, I think of strategy as being on 3 levels. All right, level 1, knowledge. Level 2, understanding. Level 3, wisdom. And I think most senior leaders in the military, most of us in this room, are level 1 strategists. Because frankly, the skills, the aptitudes that we select promotion for in the United States military are the opposite of the aptitudes that are really essential to being a good designer. So there's probably much more strategic aptitude in a class full of second lieutenants than there is in an Army War College or an Air War College class. It's just the nature of the promotion process. It's Darwinian. We weed those guys out because, frankly, the strategic lieutenant is a pain in the neck. Okay? The captain who ponders about his decisions when the commander already said, just do it, and he's still pondering, gets left behind. Okay? It's just the nature of the system. But to be a good designer, you have to be a questioner. You have to be a ponderer. You have to think in terms of higher order effects and not highly valued in our profession. But that's okay. Just the main thing about this is just to understand that on your teams, it's not going to be the most senior person who's most strategic. A document coming from a 4-star headquarters might be just as tactical as a document coming off a lieutenant's desk. It's just at a very higher level. Okay, so never assume strategy. Okay, build teams that are eclectic. The person on your team who has the keen insight might not be the person who's been selected twice below the zone and is going to be a general someday. That's okay. That's okay. Build eclectic teams. Make sure everybody has a voice, and just appreciate that strategy, for the purpose of design, is not a function of height of command. Know yourself. Know your limitations. All right. Man's got to know his limitations. Dirty Harry. What a lot of people recommend is that we probably should give a strategic aptitude test when officers first come in the military. Just like, I took a D-Lab test. I got a score. It said like, hey, if you ever wanted to study language, Bob, because of your score, you could study, very complicated languages. I'm like, okay. 'Cause I think if we gave people a score when they were lieutenants, maybe that general officer who rocked a 92 or a 78 on his aptitude test is going to sit and listen a little more carefully to that terminal lieutenant colonel strategist who got a 143, who's telling them, hey, sir, here's what I think is going on with the strategic environment. Because currently, at least in the Army, we have the 59 program, we have professional strategists, and we pick guys who are really smart, but many of them are really smart, like Orsa smart, right? They're really good at math. That doesn't make them really good at strategy. So we would pick better people to be strategists, and I think our strategists would get more respect from the senior leaders and not say, like, that's great, Colonel, very interesting. Now I got a team coming in from some think tank, and I'm going to spend 3 hours with them, so I don't have 5 more minutes for you. which I see way too often. But design is hard. All right, there's nothing more overwhelming than that blank whiteboard, that blank piece of paper, that blinking icon. So I tell people, you just gotta sling some paint. And we talk about, 2 rows diverge. I'm sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could. Do not just stand and stare down one road. Just get moving, just get moving. If you're doing the design process, you're working with your team, any idea might be a good idea, and no idea might be a good idea in and of itself, right? So throw the ideas up on the board, capture them. If someone's got a diagram in their head, throw it on the board, get it on up there. This was just splatters, the first 5, 6, 30, 50, 100 thrusts of paint, but at some point, it turned into art. And you don't know when that point's going to be, all right? So with your design teams, the critical thing is just start slinging paint. All right. Now, when I arrived at SOCOM as a colonel, coming from SOCPAC, where I was the J3, it's very focused on one type of thing. I showed up at SOCOM, and they said, hey, we just created a strategy division. We want you to work in the strategy division. And we were busy slinging paint at SOCOM. They had already formed OPTs. They had analyzed and studied each of the geographic command's regions. They had done design diagrams for each one of the regions. And they were in the process of collusion it all together into this that became known informally as the spaghetti cart, or chart rather, excuse me. And Admiral Olson was the commander at the time. And we'd use this chart and go around to various commands, or when we had gatherings like this, and the commander wanted to talk to people. And frankly, well, I think it has serious limitations. It did one thing that I thought was very powerful, is that because we did it on a giant piece of paper that was the size of a tabletop, you could roll it out on the table. A briefer could get up and quickly walk a group around the different dynamics that are taking place on the chart and the thinking behind it. And then very quickly what would happen is you would have the commander and then other commanders leaning over this chart like a bunch of second lieutenants planning a raid. All right, and they'd be talking about, well, I see this and I think this, and they'd be touching the chart and they'd be thinking about things that they hadn't been thinking about, and it would pull the conversation out of the prepared slides and into a dynamic conversation. And I don't know about you all, but too often you see this in these senior level meetings. Everybody keeps their cards pretty close to the chest. This product was really good at getting people to just kind of relax, let their hair down, and have conversations that were pretty effective. What I didn't like about it, though, is the grand idea of this was like, if we look at what's going on everywhere, it's crime, migration, and extremism. Not just regular crime, migration, extremism. We know those things have been around forever, but this very interconnected, hyper crime, migration, extremism. And everybody go like, yes. And it made people comfortable because I think it's like 3 threats, right? Like it's just like putting out a national defense strategy and say, China, Russia, Iran, VEOs, North Korea. And it goes, good. Now I know what to focus on. I got a threat. What's the problem? What's the interest? Why? Why is this hyper-connected crime, migration, extremism happening? What do we do about it? So what, right? None of this was addressed here because we stopped when we got to identifying the threat, and we never continued on to get to, well, what is it really all about? So when you're doing design, just remember, it's not about what, okay? It's really about figuring out why. You're looking for keen insights into why something is happening, and hopefully, when you get better understanding of why something is happening, then you can come to better approaches to do something strategically effective about it. Otherwise, you end up doing what we've done a lot, which is define strategic problems in tactical terms, attack the symptoms, create temporary effects. Then when we withdraw our energy from the system, it goes back to its natural state. And we've seen that a lot because we haven't been able to break strategic inertia and get past what and really just go, well, why? And really be honest about it, how our thinking. The other problem I see with design is that it's really easy to create something very complicated. Really smart, but very complicated. Big ideas are simple. All right, if you've got something that's pretty smart, but it's really complex, I would argue you're probably on the right track, but you're not there yet. Keep going. Simple is hard. Complex is pretty easy, right? Come up with a complex answer to a complex problem. You know, we got a bunch of smart teams. We do that kind of stuff all the time. The idea of design is to how do you get past that and get to a simple answer to a complex problem. Not simplistic. Very different. Simple. All right. E equals mc squared is simple. Ooh, look at all the stars is simplistic. Okay? Einstein got the simple. It's a very different thing than simplistic. But at SOCOM, many people criticized our spaghetti chart. They said, you know, this chart is lacking in so many ways. I'm an expert on Africa, and I don't see water stress on your chart anywhere. And if you don't know about water stress in Africa, your entire product is invalid. And you get this kind of comments all the time. And my strategy wingman was a nuclear engineer, submarine guy. And he took this very personal. So he said, all right, you want a chart that covers everything? I'll give you a chart that covers everything. I'm going to tell you, Joe Rogers is a brilliant man, and this is a brilliant chart. And he could take you into each one of those little bubbles and bedazzle you for an hour about the intricacies of the thinking and the data behind each one. It's not just a bunch of colorful bubbles on a chart. Very impressed. The commander looked at it. Impressed. Then he turned to the J2 and said, J2, you tell me what the strategic environment is, because this doesn't help me. This was the death of strategy at USSOCOM. We impressed our boss so much, we all got fired. I mean, they kept us around, you know, but we were irrelevant. We had rendered ourselves irrelevant because we produced a product that didn't help the commander do his job. What's our purpose? What is the purpose of your design? Help the commander do his job. Help him see through complicated things. Okay, smart can be complex. We're all impressed, okay? But genius is simple, and it's hard, and it's rare, but that's what you're striving for. All right. Now, this guy gets it. Raymond Loewy was a designer back early in the last century. He's famous for looking at, you know, kind of choo-choo trains like we think about them, and then coming up with the bullet train, all right? He put the extra curves in the Coca-Cola bottle to make it this very sensuous, iconic American image. And his philosophy is very important to what we're doing. And it's one I struggle with, frankly, as a strategist. Most advanced, yet acceptable. If you see an idea, and it's good, but it's so far in front of your boss that he can't see how he can get there, or it would require him to take on too much risk to try to get there personally, professionally, the mission of the organization, that he's probably not going to do it. You know? So it has to be as far as you can push it, rooted in what people are comfortable with, but just giving them a little bit more to get them to the next level. Now, you can hang out in front of them, hey, here's a larger, bigger vision, but you got to give them those stepping stones, or they're not going to take the step. One eye on the imagination, one eye on the cash register. For us, one eye on our actual understanding of what the problem is, what the proper solutions to be, but another eye on what can we actually get away with. I sent my boss, Joe Miller, a white paper on Al-Qaeda in 2008. And I said, sir, Al-Qaeda conducts unconventional warfare, and we're countering that with counterterrorism. We need to shift to a counter-unconventional warfare campaign. We need to challenge their campaign, not their tactics. And we need to understand that in the current strategic environment, it's just not state actors like the United States or Russia or China that can leverage the insurgent energy of someone else's population, but these tools allow these guys to do very sophisticated networked approaches to unconventional warfare. And he looked at that and said, huh. All right, I kept pushing, and I've been pushing for 12 years. We'll touch that some more. But first push, I said, hey, sir, counter unconventional warfare. And there was no Maya in that whatsoever. It was just saying, like, we need to abandon what we're doing. This will never work. And we need to move to something that's not even in doctrine. All right, too far. It did not catch fire. 1952 Studebaker, good-looking car. Raymond Loewy got his hands on the design. And in 1953, it looked like this. Now, you can see it's still a Studebaker, but he really sexied it up. I feel sorry for that guy, right, who saved up for years and years and years and bought his wife that Studebaker she's been wanting in 1952 because he had a rough day in 1953 when the new model rolled out. All right. So this product here, it serves a few purposes. First purpose is I drew this at 4 o'clock in the morning, about 10 or 12 minutes on my kitchen island. When you're doing design, don't worry about making it neat, spelling words properly. You're just trying to capture an idea in your head. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on here, so to help make it make a little more sense than what it made sense to me at 4 o'clock in the morning 3 years ago in my kitchen, that's us. That's the designer. That's that planner. You're out there. Maybe it's your design team. You're in the middle, all by yourself. Above you, strategy is the height of command. Okay, strategy is, for planning purposes, is height of command. If it came from the White House, if it came from the SecDef, if it came from the chairman, it came from the GCC, boom, boom, boom. This is what strategy is in planning. But in design, strategy is not the height of command. In design, strategy is the depth of understanding. All right, you are drilling down into a problem, trying to understand it for what it actually is. So up here, you're turning assumptions into facts, and you're turning theory into knowledge. I think about this as I drew this out. It leaped out of me. I said, like, this is the land of ed. Everything is directed, nested, constrained. Everything ends in ed, okay? Down here is the land of un. You're trying to find understanding. You're turning facts back into assumptions, because maybe it's not a fact at all. Ideology causes insurgency. No, that was a codified assumption. You know what really causes insurgency? Personal opinion. It's a population perceiving itself to have legally irreconcilable political grievance. All right? Legally irreconcilable political grievance. All ideology is something you tap into that energy with to leverage it to do things you want to do. All right? So turn those facts back into assumptions. Turn your knowledge back into theory. Be unbounded, unstructured, unconstrained, no limitations, paint outside the lines, hockey rules, okay? Think outside the lines, but when you go to your commander, you're gonna have to bring it back inside the lines for him, okay? Everything there, boxed in, directed down, boom. Down here, unconstrained, spiral, constant spiral process through all of this. Up above, that's the right answer. If anyone asks you, Colonel, what's the right answer? Well, you know what the right answer is. It's just like the major told me, a couple weeks ago at SOCPAC. It's right here. It's in the National Security Strategy. It's in the NDS. It's in the NMS. Besides, the commander of Indo-PACOM just told us. That's going to be the right answer. I'm not going to challenge that. But down here's where you're going to find a good answer. Now, hopefully, what you're going to discover is the right answer is the good answer. You say, oh, you know what? We have validated, in fact, that this is a good answer, the right answer. Or maybe you're going to discover, oh, wait a second. We got an inherent problem here. There is a flaw in the right answer, and it's pretty important, and it could lead to a catastrophic failure, like we saw in the first few slides. All right? And then your challenge is, how do I take aspects of this good answer and carry it upstairs and weave it back into the right answer? Now, here's where Maya applies, right? Because if you have too big of a shift, hey, sir, we need to abandon CT and go with counter UW. Okay, Bob, thanks. I can't work with that. I understand what you're saying. Can't work with that. All right, but so what can they work with? I need to appreciate this. and figure out how do you weave the good answer into the right answer and make the right answer better. That ultimately is the purpose of what you guys are doing with design. You're looking for a couple of nuggets that helps you either appreciate that the right answer is good or to help you make the right answer better. All right, so some other insights. So here's some challenges. Human culture shapes the right answer, and it's shaped by so much bias. The bias of our professions, the bias of our nature, the bias of our ambitions as individuals or as services or units. All these things are shaping the right answer. But down here, where the good answer lives, we're talking about human dynamics. And the theory is that human dynamics are shaped by human nature. Okay, and that is a constant, whereas those are all variables on the top. So this is our operating system. I mean, anyone could get on your Microsoft computer and do whatever you want to do on your computer until your wife catches you, right? But you can do whatever you want on your computer, but you can't do anything outside of what the operating system allows. Okay, so there's a boundary. The operating system, you know, and we have an operating system, I think, in our human dynamics as well. So the challenge up here is that often you got to ask yourself, are we fitting the problem to our solution? Okay, so if a problem comes down, SOF will go like, oh yeah, this is a perfect thing for SOF. We got the perfect solution. And the Marine Corps is going to go, like, I think you guys are missing it on this. This is clearly a problem that calls for a Marine solution. The Air Force is going to go like, no, fellas. This clearly, you know, is a problem that calls for an Air Force solution. So there is this tendency to try to shape the problem to our preferred solution, and we need to guard against that. And we need to try to understand, create an understanding that allows us to create an appropriate solution, because frankly, the problem doesn't care. And I think we have a hard time with that. Just accepting the fact that the problem doesn't care about our national interest, the problem doesn't care about our religious beliefs, the problem doesn't care about who we think we are or what we want to be. The problem just is, all right? And it's our job to understand it for what it is and then craft the best possible solution to address it for what it is. All right, so this is the art and this is the science. Planning and design and how they work together. All right, and you're not doing design to prove that you're right. All right, you're not doing it to prove your case. You should be doing design to try to come up with your theory of the case. A theory of the case. Okay, and then you have a good theory, then you can build on it. All right, so as I've worked on this personally, you know, the first thing I had to deal with was complexity. I mean, we just get smashed with data, and how do we see past all the noise, all the data, to get past all this complexity to really see a problem for what it actually is. And it's hard. And the guy I found most helpful to this was Einstein. Einstein, when he was working on his theories, all his peers were going into laboratories and they were gathering data and they're doing physical experiments and proving things scientifically, you know, to understand the universe. And Einstein took a totally different approach. And he's trying to understand the universe. It's infinite. So he asked a couple questions. Just one, what are the constants? And he was fascinated. There are constants in physical nature. You know, the speed of light, matter can't be created or destroyed, et cetera. So he took the constants. He goes, okay, now I got a handful of constants. This is something I could work with. And then he asked, how do variables interact with constants? And then he did what he called thought experiments. Basically, he'd just sit in a dark room, use his imagination. He would imagine himself flying through space in an elevator and other silly stuff. I don't pretend to get it, okay? But I appreciate what he was trying to do, right? He was trying to imagine how variables interact with constants, and through that process, he devised theories like the theory of relativity, all right? And he was immediately challenged by the system. They're like, Einstein, where's your data? Einstein, show your work. Einstein, prove your theory. He goes, I can't do any of those things, all right? This is my imagination thinking about these things, and I think this is the answer. And he took a lot of heat for that. But his answer was this. He goes, look, I can do 1,000 experiments and not prove this theory, but you could do one experiment and disprove it. So sometimes, as designers, you got to be prepared. If you come up with a theory and you've applied your imagination, you've done things appropriately, and you got a theory, and you think it's a good theory, all right, and you can't prove it, and people are challenging you, ask them to disprove it. Come work with me. You know, help me disprove this thing, because I want it to be right, and if we can disprove it, then we can either throw it away or we can get to a better one, all right? But just because you can't prove it doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean it's not good, doesn't mean it's not valid. So strategic understanding resides in the nature of the problem. I think good tactics are shaped by understanding culture, you know, and those types of temporary factors necessary for good tactics. Good strategy comes from understanding the nature of a problem. All right, so one of the things we were dealing with too is just figuring out, hey, not everything we deal with is a state. So how do we come up with a construct for thinking about these systems of governance that we're dealing with around the planet? Because they're not all states. Some are tribes. Some are states, but they don't have all the components that the dictionary says a state's supposed to have. So the idea here is that Clausewitz gave us this social trinity. I realize there's Clausewitzians in here, and they're going to say, well, that's not as remarkable trinity. That's very true. All right? It's not. This is the social trinity, but it's effective for what we're doing here. Because he says, hey, look, a state is essentially, there's a border, there's a government, there's an army, there's population. It's a state. Okay. Well, what if we get fuzzy up the boundaries? We just kind of say, like, well, we just call this a system of governance, and maybe it's not formally a state, and think of the territory as more like being the bursting radius of their governance. All right? It's not stopped by some line on a map. So United States, what's the bursting radius of our governance? It's global, right? It doesn't stop at the borders of the United States. Our governance goes global, so it affects a global population, which is how you get to this rules-based system that we believe strongly that we need to continue to lead. So any kind of defined space, some sort of governing body, some sort of security mechanism, some sort of population. It could be as big as the United States. It could be as small as a one-bedroom apartment outside the gate of Maxwell Air Force Base with a mom, dad, and a kid. Okay? That's still a system of governance. And the value of having a construct that's simple, scalable, and repeatable is sometimes you might be studying a problem like this proto-state that ISIS has created that's straddling Syria and Iraq, and there's all these different cats and dogs with all these different interests coming in from all these different angles, state actors, non-state actors, all these different groups competing for dominance in this space. And it's incredibly complex, incredibly hard to understand. And you've crafted an idea of how to help solve this problem. But you can't really run it against something that messy. Well, if you can't run it against something as messy as Syria and Iraq and the ISIS proto-state, just ask yourself, how would this work if I tried this at home with my teenage son, who's been a bit of a pain lately, you know, and how would this play out in the dynamics of my household in terms of my governance, that system of governance, that population group? You know, would this work? Would this not work? Would this create some sort of bad effect with some other population within this system? And often you can find the answers at that low scale and then scale it back up and say, like, okay, let's try it on different other examples. But what are the constants in human nature? This is something that is a very fuzzy science, and if you talk to psychiatrists, psychologists, et cetera, some people will say, like, oh yeah, human nature's a thing. And others will say, like, no, human nature's not a thing. We have free will. I don't pretend to be either one. But by just simply asking the question of myself, I said, okay, I've been studying insurgencies around the planet, different case studies, and I've been reading them for the gunfight. I've been reading them for who was the winner, who was the loser, what was the ideology, what were the political ends, what were the gains, what was the bias of the winner, what was the perspective of the loser. Frankly, I was studying them in a very tactical sense. And so I went back to those same case studies, and I asked myself a completely different question. I said, Bob, look past all of that stuff and just ask not how are these conflicts and situations of instability unique, ask, how are they the same? How are they the same? And what I found showing up over and over and over again, regardless of the time in history or the culture it affected, a handful of concepts. And the first one, I'll just call it popular legitimacy. Do people recognize the right of some system of governance to affect their lives? You're not the boss of me. If people recognize the right of some system of governance to affect their lives, it can create a positive energy in a population, at least natural stability. If they don't recognize the right of a system of governance to affect their life, foreign or domestic, formal or informal, it creates an energy for instability, an exploitable energy for revolution or resistance. And that could be from inception, right? So if we go to a country like, say, Afghanistan, and we blow out the existing government, and we replace it with a government that we think is going to be more appropriate for us, and then we work for 18 years to try to force that population to accept that governance, we are fighting against the tides of human nature, because any government created by a foreign power and sustained by a foreign power is de facto lacking in the popular legitimacy necessary for stability. And no number of culturally inappropriate devices like Western-style elections can cure that. All right, so you ask yourself also, not is this governance perceived as appropriate or as having the right to be in charge of them, but does it do its business in a way that the population it affects thinks is appropriate? Do they perceive justice under the rule of law as it affects them? Do they perceive themselves to be treated with the dignity and respect equal to similarly situated populations? And perhaps most important of all, do they perceive themselves to have trusted certain legal and effective means to address their grievances in the context of their own culture? And if you can have all those things, you can get the trust. And I see this dynamic, whether I'm looking at Afghanistan, whether I'm looking at Iraq, whether I'm looking at the current elections in the United States or the rise of Donald Trump. It's the same dynamics. Now, the difference is, in the United States of America, while we often may question the right of some government to affect our lives, or you may feel that some government's going about its business in a way you think is inappropriate, or some demographic may very validly feel that they don't receive justice under the law, they're not treated with dignity and respect equal to others. But if they believe in the system, if they believe there is a legal mechanism to address their grievances, then they do not have legally irreconcilable political grievance, all right? And so you can be unhappy with the government under one administration, happy the next, and the society remains relatively stable despite all the noise on your cable news and your Facebook feeds. So the idea here is, again, human dynamics framed by human nature. Now this model's over here is way too simple. Of course, there's no such thing as the people. There are many populations, and populations form around identities, and the same identities that populations form around in the United States, populations are forming around those same identities in 100 other countries. Okay, so this is a lesson that governments are struggling with right now. There may be some demographic in your country that's only 3%, 5% of your national demographic. And you're like, you know what? Sure, they have grievances, but I don't care because I'm the king and they're not important, and I'm just going to keep things the way I like it. Okay? That works until it doesn't work. But what's happening today is that 5% demographic in your country may be connected to a billion-person population globally. All right? And 100 years ago, you could just defeat, suppress, abuse that little 5% group in splendid isolation, and it might have been, you know, a 2-inch article on page 6 of the London Times. Now it's full motion color video, and it doesn't go away, and the very action to try to keep that population suppressed is going to make the problem worse. So this means that in great power competition, that great powers have to recognize just because you have the ability to do something, that maybe you shouldn't because of the higher order effects. So Great Britain actually learned this lesson after World War II. But Great Britain was as weak as it's ever been at the end of World War II. And when they went out and tried to reestablish their colonies, they got knocked back and they said, okay, this isn't working. So they transitioned from colonies to Commonwealth, control to influence, very savvy, very sophisticated. So they went from a system of control to a system of influence, and to this very day, it allows Great Britain to punch above its weight. We, on the other hand, very strong, young, powerful nation, we ignored the strategic lessons of Malaya, and we went into Vietnam and said we could just defeat these guys. And we didn't realize, oh, wait a second, we're not understanding how the strategic environment is changing the character of insurgency. All right? So we got bloodied up in Vietnam, and we still haven't captured that lesson. All right? We still haven't captured the lesson that just because we can impose our will on a population, it's getting harder, it's getting less durable, and you're going to have to stay there longer and force them to deal with something they don't want to deal with. And frankly, we don't need control to facilitate our interests abroad in the current strategic environment. All we need is influence. Our opponents already get it. Is China looking to control Africa? Are they looking to control, their neighbors? Not really. They're looking to get coercive influence, but they realize that to invade, to fight a war is totally counterproductive to their end game. Is Russia likely to roll tanks into the Baltics? I can't imagine why they ever would, right? Because that would be counterproductive to their strategic ends. But they're going to try to exercise influence over the spaces they think are important to their interests. We're still trying to control everything, and we're getting exhausted through the process. This is how great powers fail. When you try to control too much for too long, you get exhausted, and you get tipped over. So how do we make this transition? Well, first I got to have a narrative that allows people to figure out how they can get there. But the past informs, but doesn't constrain the future. So now we get to a simple construct, a circle of trust, and perhaps this allows us to tell a story with your commander, to sit there and go like, all right, sir, so we're going to some country. There's a host nation government. They got some security mechanisms. We've assessed the populations and how they feel about the governance affecting their lives. 2 of the population groups are inside the circle of trust. They're relatively stable. But 2 of them, for a variety of factors, shaping these perceptions, are outside the circle of trust. This is like open wounds in a society. Now, if you have this type of energy, internal actors will rise up and exploit that energy to advance their interests. Well, let's identify those guys in this particular situation. Put them on your chart. All right, we're going to show up, and we think our interests are served by keeping this guy in power. Okay, so we're in the system too. The government is creating revolutionary energy amongst these 2 population groups. It's being exploited. Our presence, because we're external, is going to create resistance energy if it's perceived as inappropriate by the populations it affects. All right? And then non-state actors and state actors are going to show up conducting UW external to this thing because they see opportunity. So state actors show up, they tap into that same energy source, they conduct UW, leverage the insurgent energy to advance their own interests. Who are those actors? How do we deter those guys? How do we help this government understand the issues and grievances with these 2 population groups? How do we help them disrupt the activities of these insurgent groups? Who are the non-state actors? Al-Qaeda, ISIS showing up. They're doing UW as well. How do we disrupt these guys? I would argue we can do CT. Oh, I got a blaster. Okay, we can do CT on this guy all day long, and these guys don't really care because these guys are foreigners. But if you do CT on this guy, he's part of these guys, and those guys, and those guys, and they care very much. So we need to try to say, like, how do I outcompete this guy for influence with this guy? So let's make it a little more real. If this is ISIS-K, and this is the Taliban, how do we conduct UW, engage the Taliban to say, hey, look, work with us, not them, and we will help you address these grievances with this government to try to expand this circle of trust and get this system to a more stable state. Instead of just countering and attacking, we got to understand that there are fundamental differences in governance going on and the roles. And a model like this helps you kind of go to any complex situation, plug the players on, think about how these players interact with each other, and come up with ideas on how to get to a better solution. Okay, so has your design activity help take the wicked out of the problem? All right, remember the SOCOM strategy team, we got fired? That product versus this product. Okay, a simple circle with a theory of the case of how different groups interact with each other is far more effective at taking the wicked out of the problem than a bubble chart that has every conceivable piece of data encapsulated in it. All right. So I think it's important to see rough products as well as finished products. I Xeroxed this out of my notebook. I was sitting at the J39 Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Group. They do their big conference every year at Andrews Air Force Base. So it's like day 2. I'd been on a panel on day 1. So day 2, I'm kind of sitting in the back, like those guys, and I'm doodling in my notebook, and I'm listening kind of with one ear while I'm thinking about stuff I'm working on at work with the other ear, and looking for little tidbits to help me kind of weave into stuff. And right here was the first thing I put on this piece of paper, was this idea: influence is important. And I drew a little circle around it. All right, so I got a big idea: influence. Then I'm thinking to myself, I wonder if I can turn it into a Venn diagram. I don't even know if I could draw a Venn diagram. So I was like, okay. So I'm trying to make the circles interact properly to create a Venn diagram with influence in the middle. I'm like, all right, that looks like something. Which then takes us to generation 3. Well, who are the key actors? You know, who's important to this influence thing that I'm trying to understand? What are the relevant relationships, between these key actors? But it's still pretty sloppy. So what if I took my little coffee cup and I stuck it on my notebook and I drew circles around the base of my coffee cup. Bingo. It all came together. All right, so what's the lesson? I think this is a critical lesson. Design in real time, all right? Knowledge is durable, but ideas are fleeting. I cannot tell you how many brilliant ideas, multi-million-dollar inventions I've created in my mind that I cannot remember 10 minutes later, okay? So hopefully some of you right now have jotted a couple things down in the course of this conversation. You thought, you know what, there's a little, I'm going to take it back to our group, and it's going to get us to the next level. But this is really important, because you never really know when this is going to turn into this, and then it turns into this. So this first cartoon was in April. In June, SOCOM got the task, came down from the chairman. SOCOM, come up with a better way to do counter-VEO. It needs to be more efficient, more effective, and you need to leave the services alone so they can focus on great power competition. Go. Go. Okay, so I go to my boss, I say, hey, sir, the only way we can do better with less is if we reframe the problem. And he's like, okay. I go, remember that white paper I sent you 12 years ago about counter-UW? He's like, yeah, you've been hounding me about that for the last 12 years. I know, sir. So let me do a COA. So they go, all right, you can do a COA. So they let me do a COA. So any place on the planet where we perceive ourselves to have interests, there is some populations who live there, and there's governance affecting their lives. And how that population feels about the governance affecting their lives will either foster stability, keep them inside the circle, resilient to exploitation by non-state actors or state actors with their UW campaigns, or it will create revolutionary energy, which will make them unstable and make them exploitable by external actors. This is revolutionary energy. It leads to internal dynamics, which we have classified as a form of irregular war in all our books, but probably better thought of as a form of illegal democracy. And war theory doesn't work very well against it, frankly. Then we show up, and we affect this space with our policies and with our presence. And we need to appreciate that in the current strategic environment, you can create resistance by occupation, by policy, just as easy as you can by your physical presence, perhaps more so. You don't even have to be there. As long as they perceive that your policies are creating an obstacle between them and their government, that's creating an irreconcilable situation for them, you're creating resistance energy. And we do FID to work with this guy, Foreign Internal Defense, for those who aren't familiar with that doctrinal term. All right. And if you have revolutionary energy and resistance energy in a population, then somebody's going to come along. It might be a VEO non-state actor like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or it might be a state actor like Iran or China or Russia, someone else who's got interests counter to our own. And they're going to use their ideology, they're going to use their narrative, they're going to use their influence to tap into that energy, to tap into that resistance and revolutionary energy to advance their own interests. Now, our challenge is we have been competing against. All our competition's been around the periphery of the VIN. We're doing CT against this guy, COIN against this guy, okay? The competition is not us against Al-Qaeda. We've been thinking about it wrong. We're competing with Al-Qaeda. We are competing for influence with that population. So that what we need to do now is a total reframe. It's not how do I defeat or disrupt this guy, or not defeat, I do want to disrupt him, okay? But I need to ask myself, what is it about our foreign policy that's creating friction, creating resistance energy in this population? How do we adjust how we're approaching this space, how we're approaching these populations, how we're approaching our business to reduce the resistance energy that we're creating through our policies? How do we help this host nation appreciate the different identity-based populations within their population and how their governance is being perceived by those populations? Because frankly, often you can't see it yourself. Okay, you can't see it, and it's helpful for an outsider to come along and say, you know, this policy of yours, or this approach, or how you're treating this particular demographic is actually what's creating the exploitable energy in this population. So if you would change these simple things, you know, like the Saudis, for an example, one of the things that their population has been asking for years is a judiciary system that can't be controlled by the king, that's independent of the king. Well, what do we see in the last 2 weeks here in the United States is causing revolutionary energy in our own population, right? A concern that the president is interfering in the judicial system in ways that could make justice less just. Just fundamental things like justice. And how do you help a guy see where they're making mistakes? And how do we recognize not just where we're making mistakes abroad, but where we're potentially making mistakes at home? And how do we avoid these things? Because our system works, and it's a brilliant system, but we can break it. We've broken plenty. We can break ours too. So here's the idea: strategic influence. We're not doing counter UW. The State Department hated that. They go, we don't even understand the words coming out of your mouth. I go, okay. How about if I call it strategic influence? We are competing not against. We are competing with. We're competing for strategic influence. Not how do we get people to do stuff they don't want to do, but how do we get people to think of us in more positive terms? Okay, how do we be the partner of trust, or partner of choice? Not just partner of choice with the government, not just with the security forces, but with the population and with insurgent groups. This one causes some people, they're like, what? You're going to go talk to Boko Haram? You're going to go talk to the Taliban? You're going to talk to Al-Shabaab? Yes. Yes, we need to talk to those guys. But we don't have to give them what they want. That's craziness. Just like we need to talk to North Koreans. We don't give the North Koreans what they want, but you got to talk to them. And we got to build lines of influence. Because ultimately, we're trying to outcompete these guys that are the real problem, the exploiters of the energy. Okay, so CT bundled all this stuff together so we could hit it with one big hammer. Strategic influence disaggregates it. Only do CT on foreign guys. Create off-ramps. Hey, how can this insurgent come in from the cold, work within the rule of law? Create influence with the insurgents. Build partner professionalism. How do these security forces go out and engage a population in ways that are perceived as positive, like we've done in the Philippines, Colombia? Not how do I train them to be little hunter-killer teams, dressed like GIs, acting like GIs, and killing the population on behalf of a government that's unwilling to evolve, counterproductive. And how do we map out these populations and really understand them and how they feel and who's competing for influence amongst them? All right. So ultimately, in all this stuff, you want to take the wicked out of the problem. You want to give your boss a soundbite. When I was working on strategic appreciation for General Votel, he had been getting that J2 product for quite some time. It was all about threats. I wrote one that didn't really talk about threats. And I said, in the current strategic environment, I think the really interesting thing is that power is shifting. Power is shifting between governments to populations, and power is shifting between states. Okay, and as power is shifting and you have rising states, there is a friction as those rising states seek to expand their sovereign privilege. Okay, and we need to understand that energy and how do we manage that? How do we enhance our deterrence in different places? How do we make adjustments? And we need to understand the energy in these population groups and how do we help manage that energy? Because so long as that energy is there, someone's going to come along and exploit it. And we can defeat group after group after group, and just the next group's going to come along. So when power shifts, the game changes. Doesn't matter what the soundbite is, but come up with something that your boss can walk into a meeting. Give him a tool he can put on the table. Give him a soundbite he can use, because he might only get a chance to say 2 or 3 things in that big meeting with all that brass. So this is what we talked about. Art. There is an art to all of this. Some of you are going to be artists, some of you not. Don't worry about that. Understand it, understand your limitations. Most advanced yet acceptable. I struggle with this one every day, okay? But you got to build those stepping stones to help people get towards a better idea. Don't expect them to go too far. Try to get to good answers and try to make the right answers better, all right? And Maya is definitely going to be a tool in your toolkit for that. And think about the nature of strategy, all right? And these are human dynamics, okay? Whether you're talking about war, that's why Clausewitz and Thucydides and Sun Tzu resonate over time. Those guys' work is rooted in human nature. If someone wrote a strategy book and it's about, here's what I learned during World War I or doing my tour in Vietnam, it's interesting, but it's not as durable as one that said, like, hey, here's a universal construct I've been thinking about, and I can apply this construct and show you how to apply it across time in different cultures. And the tenets, those are just things I've learned. Some of them might be good, some might be bad. If it works for you, take it and use it. If it doesn't work, don't worry about it. Let's see, here we go. This is the final click. All right, so 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. Okay, pick your road. Some of you guys are going to be good strategists. Take that road. All right, some of you are going to be good commanders. Take that road, but appreciate that you're going to need a good strategist, to come in and sit down with you and help you mull things over. Maybe it's your senior enlisted advisor. Maybe it's your driver, okay? Or maybe it's that terminal major, who really irritates you at staff meetings. It's okay, everybody's bringing something to the table. All right, so that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions. All right, I got $5 for whoever has the first question. Actually, I brought a coin. I brought a coin last year, and that worked. I got this cool SOCOM coin. Boom, questions. I don't have a coin. All right, that's fine. I'm going to be around this afternoon, this morning. So as you guys go back to your seminar groups, it's going to be walking me around. I'm happy to walk in and just sit there and watch what you're doing. Or if you guys want to say, hey, here's something we're thinking about, or where do you think this design is going, or anything like that, I'm happy to just have a conversation, or I can drill back in if there's anything you say, like, you know what, you said one thing during your presentation was absolutely ridiculous, and I need you to, clear this up for me. Fine, but whatever. So I'll be here. So appreciate the time. Thank you, guys.
Sure.
Yes. Oh, I get a coin. All right.
Thank you for your timely brief on op design. On behalf of Air War College class of 2020, please accept the coin.
I do. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.